Okay, looks like we're beginning. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining in our event today on fermented food with Harborview Dietitians, Lisa Messerly, Ashley Jones, and Kelly Farias. We are so thrilled to be able to host this platform for our dietitians. With that being said, I will go ahead and turn things over to our presenters. Thank you.
All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Kelly, and I'm one of the inpatient dietitians here at Harborview. Just a little background, Lisa is actually an outpatient dietitian who works in a variety of clinics, and Ashley actually splits her time between inpatient and outpatient, just so that you guys have a little bit of an idea who we are. So I wanted to just kind of give a little bit of a background. We actually created this presentation to be in person about 2 years ago before the pandemic. So we hope to just keep you guys all engaged still and try to get you guys just as excited about fermented foods. I wanted to talk about an article I actually found the other day on Today's Dietitian, and it was really interesting. About 1,100 dietitians were surveyed, and 78% believed that consumers were now eating and just viewing food a little bit differently, given that the COVID pandemic. So just the year consisted of staying home and just cooking a lot more. And they generated this list that the dietitians surveyed, and they created a top 10 superfoods that consumers would be seeking in the year 2021. And shockingly, fermented foods was actually number one. So it's kind of interesting just to start our little presentation. Okay, so the next slide. So just with that in mind, sorry, Lisa, you can go back. With that in mind, here are our objectives for today. As practicing dietitians, we recognize that the topic of fermented foods is gaining a lot of attention, and there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding what they are. So we're gonna just learn about what fermented foods are, discuss their potential health benefits, and provide you guys some recipes to see if you're so bold enough to make them. Okay, so fermented foods is defined as foods or beverages produced through controlled microbial growth and the conversion of food components through enzymatic action. So it's kind of complex and sciencey, but for example, the microorganisms like yeast and bacteria break down the food components, such as the sugar, into other products known as like organic acids, gases, or alcohol. So historically, food fermentation was performed as a preservative to fight bad bacteria. And it's also known to enhance the organoleptic properties, such as that taste and texture, or what we see fermented foods as like that tangy, pungent, and aromatic. Okay. So to just get a little bit more specific about fermentation, there are two main methods. The first is what we call natural fermentation. And this is seen in like sauerkraut or kimchi. It's referred to as wild ferments or spontaneous ferments. And in this natural fermentation, the microorganisms are present naturally in the raw food or the processing environment. So alongside that, there's the culture-dependent ferments, which we see primarily in kefir, kombucha, and natto. And these foods can be fermented via the addition of starter cultures. Okay, so now that we're aware of the two methods of fermentation, we're going to talk specifically more about food. We discovered that nearly every culture has at least one fermented food in its culinary heritage. So we're going to go through a few in the next following slides. So the first on the left is the sauerkraut. So as many of you guys are aware, sauerkraut is known as one of the best known national dishes in Germany. It is basically cut raw cabbage that has been fermented by various lactic acid bacteria, and it's known for its long shelf and its distinctive sour flavor. And we have some more details to come in the following slides. This middle picture is called natto, and it's a traditional Japanese food of fermented soybeans. So they are steam cooked and then fermented with a healthy bacteria known as Bacillus subtilis.
Yes.
It is sold prepackaged in like small
Not
40
for a
or
long
50.
time.
I went in December and I got my check for $350. So you never know.
Yeah.
Sorry, Kelly, you were on
Sorry.
mute.
Okay.
Meeting one of the guests here.
Okay. So natto is available for sale in the refrigerated section of Japanese
How would
and
I
other
approve?
Asian grocery stores.
Not gonna get it $50.
In Japanese
no.
cuisine, the most basic way that it's enjoyed is actually served over hot steamed rice, as you can see in the image as well. And it's mostly eaten for breakfast. It has a pretty pungent smell, and in my opinion, it kind of has a funky texture, which can be very acquired. It does contain a high amount of protein, though, good fats, vitamin, minerals, and fiber. And our third one on the right here is kimchi, which many of you might be aware of too. And this is well known in Korea. It's their national dish, which is very similar to sauerkraut. It's made from napa cabbage, radishes, green onions, and it's mixed with a spicy paste, which we're going to talk about later in the following slides as well. Okay, so to move on to our fourth food item. So this is called gari, and it's classified as a starchy or carbohydrate food. And it's made from processing raw cassava or yuca. And it's widely known in Nigeria and other West African countries. It can be either white or yellow, as you can see on that right image. And it's processed by milling or blending. You sieve it, and then it's fermented, and then you can actually stir fry the cassava roots. And there's 3 known forms, which kind of got a little complicating. So it's just described as fine, medium, and coarse. And it's very interesting, actually, because cassava contains a high amount of cyanide or hydrocyanic acid, and which it needs to allow it to undergo fermentation, because this process actually eradicates the cyanide in cassava, which makes it a very important process that can't be neglected. The nutritional value of gari includes being very rich in starch and fiber. It's a great alternative food for products made from white flour or rice, so it's gluten-free. And the high starch content of cassava flour actually makes it particularly easy to digest. And you guys can actually just Google or YouTube how to make gari at home, and it's pretty interesting. So I challenge you to do that. Okay, so our last 2 food items on the left is poi, and this is most common in Hawaii. It's made from the food form of taro. So as you can see in one of the image, there's the taro corms. So in order to cook them, you basically crush and pound them into a starchy paste by just adding water throughout the process. So yeast and lactic acid bacteria are naturally found in the plant's surface, which helps ferment the mixture, which is kind of leads to that sour poi. It is very easily digested due to the smaller size of the starch granules. It is fat-free, high in fiber as well, low sodium, gluten-free, and it's a good source of vitamin B, calcium, and phosphorus. So in like the restaurants, you'll see it more commonly as like the purple paste in this bowl. That's what it usually looks like in the restaurants when you go to Hawaii or here too. And then our last food item is chutney, which you can see on the right. It's a spicy or savory condiment, which is originating in India. It's usually made from a variety of items, fruits, vegetables, and or herbs. And they usually add vinegar, sugar, and spices. It's essentially a sauce that goes alongside their food, and it requires a low and a slow cook time. And it's usually added with like onion, ginger, garlic, and occasionally fruits such as like cranberries, mangoes, rhubarbs, etc. They also, just as you can imagine, add a lot of ground spices, so like cayenne, garam masala, and salt. Again, it's gluten-free, contains carbohydrates, fiber, vitamins, minerals such as vitamin B, vitamin C, E, and it does have sodium from the salt. Okay, So that kind of sums up just a few food items that we thought were pretty interesting in regards to fermented foods. Okay, so history. Who doesn't love a little bit of history? So the earliest history of fermentation dates back as far as 6000 BC. And this was primarily seen in the form of fermented beverages in the earliest days. It actually wasn't until the mid 1800s that people started to understand what was happening to make their food ferment. So in case y'all didn't know who Louis Pasteur was, a French chemist in 1856, he's the one who connected yeast to the process of fermentation. And at this time, again, fermentation was still being used solely to increase the holding and the storing properties of food. And then later on in 1910, fermented foods were first considered as beneficial to health. So this is kind of where we start to get a little bit interested. Elie Mechnikov, a Russian bacteriologist, discovered the bacterial strain Bulgarian bacillus in fermented milk, which is later classified as Lactobacillus acidophilus. And he actually named this strain after the Bulgarian culture he was studying for their long lifespan of 87 years, which, as you can imagine, was exceptional for the early 1900s. And then interestingly, I was reading, and a Yale researcher in 1935, his name was Leo Rechtger, found that strains of lactobacillus were incredibly active within the human gut, which kind of paved the way for the development of probiotics. So this last bullet, fermented foods have become more popular and trendy, as you all have known, because of their inherent probiotic health.
Okay, so just to add on to what Kelly was talking about, so your fermented foods are going to produce your probiotics. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the difference between probiotic and prebiotic. So probiotics are defined as live microorganisms, which when administered in adequate amounts, confer a health benefit on the host. Examples of common strains include Lactobacillus, Bifidobacterium, Saccharomyces, Enterococcus, Streptococcus, Bacillus, and Escherichia. So there's probably hundreds of different strains, but these 7 are probably the most common. And you're going to find probiotics in fermented dairy products such as yogurt and kefir. And then there's non-dairy fermented foods, which are going to include kimchi, kombucha, sauerkraut, miso, natto, and tempeh. And what these do is they really help to diversify our gut microbiome. And our gut microbiome is basically all of the bacteria and the fungi and the viruses that create our human body. And there's a really interesting study that I read about that just came out in 2021, and it was done at Stanford University. And they took 36 healthy individuals and they randomized them either into a high fermented food diet or a high fiber diet. And they followed the diet for about 10 weeks. And I would say that the high fermented food diet ate about 4 to 6 servings of fermented foods a day, and the high fiber diet ate about 40 grams of fiber a day. So both groups were having quite a bit of either fiber or fermented foods. And after 10 weeks, researchers looked at the diversity of the microbiome, inflammatory markers, and also immune response. And the fermented food group had an increase in overall microbiome diversity, and they had a significant decrease in 19 markers of inflammation, which they actually saw a stronger effect from the more larger and more persistent servings. Whereas the high fiber group didn't see any increase in microbiome diversity, and they didn't have any changes to the 19 inflammatory markers, which I thought was really interesting because a lot of times we think that high fiber is going to increase your microbiome and have a lot of health benefits. But in this study, they didn't see any change with the high fiber group, and it was only in the fermented food group that they saw changes. And another interesting finding is that they looked at interleukin-6, and that was an inflammatory marker that had decreased in the fermented food group that didn't decrease in the high fiber group. And that inflammatory marker is linked to autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, and it's also linked to chronic stress. So I just thought it was interesting that in a small number of people and in a short amount of time, they were able to see a change in that inflammatory marker. So I put the resource here on the slide in case you want to go read the entire study, but I thought it was an interesting study that was done recently. Okay, so prebiotics are going to not necessarily be bacteria themselves, but they are considered the natural non-digestible food component that helps feed the good bacteria, which then helps the good bacteria grow and multiply. So I always think all living things need to eat. So these prebiotics are, you can think of them as the food that helps support and supply nourishment to the healthy bacteria. So food sources of prebiotics are going to include bananas, flaxseed, beans, and vegetables such as garlic, onion, leeks, asparagus, artichokes, and dandelion greens. Okay, so there's a lot of research that's coming out that shows that there's potential benefit to probiotics. I think when I was looking up research for this, there was over 100 benefits that probiotics show in the body. So these are just a few that I'm going to go over. So they have been shown to help improve our immune system. Probiotics help to increase the production of antibodies and other disease-fighting cells in the body, which then in turn creates a stronger immune system. There's also a really strong connection between the brain and the gut. So 90% of our serotonin, which is kind of considered our feel-good hormone, lives in our gut. So by improving the gut health, research supports that it can improve mood, stress, feelings of sadness, and improve memory in people with Alzheimer's. Research also supports that probiotics are effective in lowering total and LDL cholesterol by absorbing fiber from the intestines and generating propionic acid. And this particular acid has the ability to reduce the production of cholesterol in the liver. There's also lots of research that supports improved GI function. So it improves diarrhea, IBS, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, and constipation. There's research to support that it reduces the risk of colon cancer, and it can also, probiotics can also help with nutrient absorption. There's research that supports that certain species of bacteria can actually increase the availability and absorption of minerals such as calcium, phosphorus, zinc, magnesium, and iron. And then I just put many, many more because I think you can kind of search the research and find that probiotics pretty much help a lot of conditions out there. But just one thing to keep in mind is that different strains of probiotics have different effects on health, and we're still trying to figure out which strains work best for what conditions. They've kind of mapped and figured out some, but they definitely haven't mapped and figured out all of the different strains and what conditions they work with. We also don't know specific doses, so we have no idea how much to tell somebody to take and how much that will help their condition. Many probiotics are sold as supplements, which don't require FDA approval. So what's marketed on the bottle may not actually be in the bottle. So you just have to be really careful when you're buying them as supplements. And there's still lots of research that's needed. So we know a little bit about them, but we don't know a lot about the benefits of probiotics. So probably it's best to include a variety of healthy foods in your diet, along with several sources of fermented foods to improve the overall gut health, which will then potentially have benefit on the host. And here at Harborview, we're actually, the dietitians are part of a research study. So the RDs are currently using Nancy's Kefir in ICU patients to help reduce diarrhea in patients with C. diff. So Nancy's Kefir contains 60 billion colony-forming units, or CFUs, of multi-strain probiotic bacteria. And the preliminary data has shown that diarrhea has been decreased in patients with C. diff with the use of Kefir. And we don't use it in people who are immunocompromised and complex GI patients, which I'm going to talk a little bit about next. So just a little word of caution, they are generally considered safe for most people. However, certain populations should not use probiotics or fermented foods. So those are people with immunocompromised, such as bone marrow transplants or organ transplants, somebody undergoing chemotherapy, and we don't recommend it in people with HIV with CD4 counts less than 50. Also complex GI patients, such as short gut syndrome, ileostomies or colectomies, ileus, GI bleeds, and bowel obstructions, we don't recommend. Also valve replacements and central IV lines, it's not recommended.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some fermented foods and the process by which these are made. So kefir versus yogurt. They are both fermented milk products that contain probiotics that benefit our gut health, but the process by which these are fermented does differ a little bit. So as Kelly described at the beginning, you have a culture-dependent ferment and a natural ferment. These are both culture-dependent. So for yogurt, you would pour the milk of your choice into a pot and bring to boil and reduce the heat and simmer for about 10 minutes. Then what you want to do is remove the pot from heat and allow it to sit for 30 to 60 minutes. So I will say that if you're making a fermented food that contains any, that has instructions on heat, you want to wait to add the live cultures after it cools down, because the heat can actually kill the live cultures and kill the good bacteria. So once the milk has cooled to a point where you can leave your finger in it for like 10 to 15 seconds, then you want to pour a cup of plain yogurt with active cultures into your milk. At that point, you'll incubate it for about 6 to 10 hours, and you have your own homemade batch of yogurt. Kefir, on the other hand, is more liquid and pourable than yogurt. What you do for kefir is you have a glass jar and you're going to put kefir grains together with milk. Now, kefir grains you see in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. These aren't true grains, but they're actually a rubbery cellular structure made of proteins, lipids, and sugars. And so you combine milk together with kefir grains, and then you have a lot of these instructions too for fermented foods are being exposed to the air. So you won't cap the jar. You'll put like a coffee filter over the top with a little rubber band and leave it out on the counter in a semi-warm, cool climate for about 24 hours. And you have homemade kefir. At that point, you can use the grains for about 3 to 4 batches worth, but you obviously want to strain them out and keep your liquid kefir in the fridge. When it comes to selecting yogurt, for instance, you want to just keep it simple. Trying to pick a yogurt that has as few ingredients and as little added sugar as possible. Plain and unsweetened yogurt is best for our overall health, but apart from that, most choices are up to a personal preference. For a good source of probiotic, you're going to see names like Bifidobacterium, Lactobacillus acidophilus, L. casei, L. rhamnosus. Lisa named a bunch. So the more of those names you see is a very good indicator of diversity of amount of live bacteria your yogurt's going to supply, because you're going to want to look at, number one, the variety of strains. So how many of those names you see, and then the actual quantity of each strain. So counts that are in the billions, like the Nancy's, is a really excellent source of probiotic. Also, if it is heat treated, it will have, if it's heat treated after you add the cultures and you're buying a yogurt, it'll say heat treated after culturing. So you want to avoid those yogurts if you're looking for a good source of live bacteria. All right, next. And so because kefir is liquid already, it makes it very easy to put a smoothie together. You can just add some bananas, berries, whatever fruits you want together with kefir and blend. And this handout, or this recipe will be on your handout. Okay, so apple cider vinegar. This is essentially a 2-step process where you're taking apples and water and sugar and you're making a hard cider. And then at that point, you're turning the hard cider into vinegar. So this process involves just putting a bunch of apple scraps into a quart jar, combining it with sugar and filtered water, shaking it all together, and once again, kind of leaving that exposed to the air and getting a coffee filter over the top, letting it sit for about 2 weeks, and then you have hard cider. At that point, you can either enjoy your hard cider or you can go on to create some apple cider vinegar. So you'll want to compost the scraps. And then you're going to let this sit, reserve the liquid, obviously let it sit for another 4 weeks. And the longer you let it sit, you would stir it regularly. if you let it sit for 6 weeks to 6 months, you're going to get this culture formed on the top, which is called the mother culture. I don't know if you've ever bought this organic, raw, unfiltered apple cider vinegar, but it has kind of a floaty jellyfish looking thing in there. That's called the mother. You could save that if you were going to make more apple cider vinegar, and you could use it for your next batch to turn cider into vinegar more quickly. So I guess this falls into the category of both a natural ferment or a culture dependent ferment if you were to add the mother for your next batch. But there are some research that supports that apple cider vinegar may improve insulin sensitivity and help lower blood sugar responses after meals, improve satiety, and also contains polyphenols, which we know as a potential cancer-fighting nutrient. So for people who wish to consume apple cider vinegar for these benefits, you would mix 1 to 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar into a large glass of water and drink it before meals or just before bedtime, where it can potentially have a positive effect on blood sugar. Okay, miso. This is a condiment made from fermented soybean paste, which is popular in Japan. And the fermentation process promotes growth of probiotics using Aspergillus oryzae, which is a mold that is widespread in Japan. And this is the main probiotic strain that's found in miso. Research shows that probiotics in this condiment could improve digestion, as with many fermented foods. Also, could potentially reduce liver and breast cancer and pancreatic cancer. This could be multifold. It could be because the antioxidant activity of the soybeans or even the hormonal effect of soy. But also I found some research that showed that taking just the A. oryzae probiotic separate from the beans produced anti-tumor molecules against pancreatic cancer cells. And so this data suggests that the A. oryzae derived molecules could inhibit the progression of pancreatic cancer. All right, so to make miso, you're going to soak and cook soybeans. You will then blend soybeans and you'll have essentially a soybean paste at this point. Then you're going to mix the soybean paste with koji rice. So this is an actual rice that's been inoculated with the A. oryzae. And then once you have this together, the mold releases enzymes that ferments the rice and decomposes its carbohydrates and proteins. And you're going to take this mixture and transfer it into the container. Now, again, with fermented foods, a lot of the fermentation process happens anaerobically for some recipes. So for this, you want to, make sure all the air bubbles are out of this paste, rolling it into little small tennis balls and kind of mashing it up. And then you're gonna have kind of this big, pancake of paste where you're gonna cover with saran wrap and just make sure there's no air exposed to it. That placing it in a cool, dark location for up to 6 months to 12 months for a very deep fermented bean paste. And this here is another recipe that you'll have on your handout for a sesame miso salad dressing.
Okay, so who here thinks that pickles contain probiotics? It's a little bit of a trick question because some pickles do contain probiotics and some don't. So only fermented cucumbers are a source of probiotics, not the pickled cucumbers using vinegar. So key things you want to look at on the label are terms like naturally fermented or no vinegar. If you see vinegar anywhere on the label or in the ingredients, then the pickles or the cucumbers are pickled and not fermented. And the pickled cucumbers will not contain any probiotics. And then another thing to look at is just make sure that it's not heat processed, because like Ashley said, the heat would kill the probiotics. So these Bubby's pickles are a brand of pickles that you can find at like Whole Foods, QFC, PCC, and they are a fermented pickle. And then I was also at Trader Joe's yesterday and I saw a Trader Joe brand of fermented pickles. They're usually found in the refrigerator aisle because they need to be chilled. So if you're on the interior of the grocery store and you're shopping for pickles, most of those are going to be, they're going to have vinegar in them.
Okay, so kimchi. So as I mentioned earlier, it's very similar to sauerkraut, being a fermented cabbage, but the only difference is it is flavored with Korean items such as garlic, ginger, and the chilies. So if you're not aware of what kimchi tastes like, it's sour, tangy, it can be salty, definitely spicy, and has a pretty pungent smell to it. The fermentation process is what gives the kimchi its sour flavor, as I kind of mentioned in the other previous items before too. So it involves a lacto-fermentation process that uses the lactobacilli bacteria to break down that sugar and starches into lactic acid. It's considered a natural functional food for the high presence of dietary fibers, minerals, vitamins, capsaicin, organic acids, polyphenols, and fermentation byproducts. And the presence of these compounds provide a variety of benefits to human health, which we kind of have touched on in terms of fermented foods, but anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, antioxidant, anti-cancer, anti-obesity, probiotic properties, cholesterol reduction, and anti-aging properties. So the fermentation, you can kind of see the ingredients on the left-hand side. The right-hand side image is just something that contains kimchi that you may order like in a restaurant. The process of fermentation is usually about 3 to 4 days. And kind of like Ashley was saying, it's typically stored somewhere dark or cool. For example, like in your basement or a lower, cooler cabinet in the pantry. And what's interesting, if you want like a softer, tangier kimchi, you just continue to ferment for three or more days, depending on what you prefer. Some ways that you can enjoy kimchi is served on top of like potato pancakes that you can get at a variety of different restaurants. You can use it to put inside of your omelet just alongside like natto from like Japan. A lot of people do that. You can make homemade fried rice. You can put it into like Korean style tacos or burritos, which is super trendy right now. And as well, you can add it to like any noodle dish as well to just kind of make it spicier, or to like any type of broth as well.
Or a grilled cheese sandwich.
Or a grilled cheese sandwich.
Okay, kombucha. So I'm sure many of you have tried kombucha. This has gained a lot of popularity over the last decade, I'd say. This is a sugared tea that has been fermented via a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. This is what a SCOBY stands for, if you've ever heard of the acronym SCOBY. This is a mat-like pellicle or tea fungus that feeds off the sugar, and you get a new SCOBY with each batch of kombucha that you make. It's thought that kombucha originated in China 2,000 years ago. And in terms of flavor, as with many fermented foods, this mildly acidic, sour, effervescent, somewhat of an acquired taste. So this definitely has a distinct flavor on its own, but you can buy it with various flavors. And I'll talk a little bit about the process of adding flavor. So the fermentation gives kombucha its unique characteristics because it adds the carbon dioxide, alcohol, and acetic acid, and other acidic compounds, as well as some probiotic bacteria. Next. Kombucha has been shown to help with digestion, prevent microbial infections, and with the probiotic benefits discussed earlier, could have positive influences on cholesterol. You know, probiotics potentially bind with cholesterol in the gut to stop it from being absorbed and help produce bile acids, which in turn help metabolize fat and cholesterol in the body. It's made with green, black, or oolong tea. So avoid herbal tea. Herbal teas don't provide the nutrients necessary to feed the kombucha, but we know that teas in themselves already have beneficial antioxidants, and we know that antioxidants are helpful compounds that stop free radicals, which are harmful compounds that cause cell damage. However, kombucha actually has more antioxidants than regular tea because of this acidic environment and the enzymes from the yeast and bacteria culture. They break the larger antioxidants into many smaller antioxidants. So it's really no wonder that kombucha has potential host of healing properties because it's made from a beverage that already has amazing health benefits. And then the kombucha makes it easier for the body to absorb the benefits through the magic of fermentation. So you can purchase kombucha in most grocery stores in the organic section with your refrigerated foods. And this is a picture of GT Synergy Kombucha, a very popular brand. As a side note, Whole Foods in particular has an alcoholic version of kombucha. You must be 21 years of age to buy. So by law, the US defines an alcohol beverage as any beverage in liquid form which contains not less than 0.5% of alcohol by volume. So all commercial kombuchas, teas are labeled non-alcoholic because they contain less than 0.5% of alcohol. However, with either the Whole Foods version or even brewing your own homebrewed kombuchas, you can have significantly higher alcohol content, which varies as much as how much SCOBY you're using, the hotter the temperature, and the more sugar and the increased brewing time. So making kombucha is a bit of a process. I would say once you get the process going, it becomes a lot faster, as with many routines, but you're first going to need to obtain a SCOBY from a friend to start a new batch. So SCOBY with some starter tea. You can also purchase these online or at a health food store. And other than that, you're really just going to need kind of your basics as if you're going to brew a pot of tea. The tea itself, some sugar and water, and then a big glass vessel. So I would say like even just a gallon size jar is good for most recipes. So you will fill this gallon jar with your starter tea and your SCOBY, and then you're gonna make your batch of tea separate. So you're gonna boil water, add sugar, let the sugar dissolve, steep the tea bags, and once again letting this tea cool before you combine it with the SCOBY. And you will then have it all together in this big gallon jar, and don't cap it. You put a cloth or a coffee filter over the top, put it away in a closet, let it ferment for a week or two. And then you have kombucha. You can at that point bottle it. It's nice to put kombucha into separate 16-ounce bottles like I showed in the Synergy brand. If you save some of those from the store, it's perfect for bottling your own. And then you can either, next slide, bottle at that point, or you can add flavors. So you can have a lot of fun with it. It's a bit more of a process, but certainly blending berries or different types of fruits, adding a touch of fruit juice, ginger, mint, all different flavor ideas that you can add to each bottle. Now keep in mind, more fruit is essentially more sugar, which is more fizz, which is more carbonation. So you could refrigerate it as soon as you add the flavors. And if you want to have a carbonated tea, you can even go further and add about a teaspoon of sugar to each bottle. And then at this point, you do want to cap it because it's going to start to produce, it's going to ferment and create bubbles, but you don't want those to escape. You can keep it in the closet for another week. And then once you refrigerate it, the fermentation stops and you will have a carbonated tea when you go to drink it. Just don't let it sit for too long, especially in the summer. I've had bottles explode on me, so it's really not fun. All right, sauerkraut. So we mentioned this a little before. Traditional fermented cabbage dish. I'm sure all of you have had sauerkraut. The basics that you need for sauerkraut is cabbage and salt. You can certainly get super fancy with it. I have a lovely recipe that adds carrot slices and garlic and roasted jalapenos. But really the main two ingredients you need is cabbage and salt. And so you take an average quart jar that you see there in the upper left, that's about probably a head of cabbage. So to make sauerkraut, you get a head of cabbage, you're going to chop it up like you see. And then about 1/3 of the head at a time, you're going to add a teaspoon of salt and just start squeezing the cabbage. You're going to squeeze it combined with that salt, and it's actually going to draw water out of the cabbage. And then you'll take that second section of the head of cabbage and add another teaspoon of salt, and then do the same thing. And then for the third teaspoon, or the third part, you're going to basically have a full head of soggy cabbage wherein the water's been drawn out of it. And you put it all combined together in a glass jar. And then again, this fermentation, it's a natural ferment, actually no culture is required, but it does take place underwater anaerobically. So it's nice before you start to maybe save an outer leaf of that cabbage head to, because you're going to be pressing all of the cabbage down below its water line, and then maybe put like the cabbage leaf on top with a little shot glass to keep it staying under. And you're going to keep this in a cool, dark place for 3 to 4 weeks. And you will have sauerkraut. And now we're going to do a little show and tell. Okay, all right. So just to kind of go over what I was talking about with the sauerkraut, I was a little lazy and I bought a coleslaw mix, which is shredded cabbage. But I started off with about this much, and then I added salt, and all I did was squeeze it with salt. And you can see there all the liquid that kind of gets drawn out of it. It takes a little time. Then you combine all of it together. So we can pretend that I had a full head of cabbage, and it'll just need to be pressed down like you see here. The water comes up, and for a full head of cabbage, you will definitely have, you know, quite a bit of water once it gets to the top, and you're going to have that outer cabbage leaf with kind of pressing it down. And because fermentation, it does kind of like create gas, you want to have even just a cookie pan or something underneath if it's in your closet to not make a mess. Okay, so secondly, I wanted to show what a SCOBY looks like. So this is some kombucha tea. I've been brewing my own batch for close to a decade, I think. And so I grabbed one of my SCOBYs, but it's, you know, just really this kind of alien pancake looking thing. And so this is exactly precisely what you would need. Like if I handed this to you, you would have enough to start brewing your own kombucha. Just one SCOBY and a little tea will set you for life. Okay, and I didn't do a slide on this guy here. This is sourdough starter. So I'm sure you've all had sourdough. And so this is I don't know if you'd call it a natural ferment. I think it naturally starts. It's just basically flour and water. And so if you get some sourdough starter from a friend, and you want to say tomorrow you're going to make some sourdough pancakes, you look up the recipe for sourdough pancakes, it might call for 1/2 cup of sourdough starter. So you're obviously going to take some out of your collection. And if you want to continue baking with sourdough, you have to feed the culture. So you're going to have to feed it. And the rule of thumb is equal parts of starter plus flour plus warm water. So if I'm left with now 1/2 cup of starter after I make the pancakes, I will add 1/2 cup of flour and 1/2 cup of warm water. And they say don't let metal touch it. I don't know if it's true, but apparently it kills the culture. So I just use a wooden spoon. Now this is what happens when it sits for a while, and this is perfectly fine. It has even sometimes a little bit of a gray tint to the top. The gray is fine. You don't want black or orange or fuzzy. But you will then want to feed it after you discard some in your recipe, and then you'll at least want to let it set out overnight, and it'll bubble and it'll do all the things, and you can keep it out on the counter as long as you're kind of continuing. If you, it depends on how often you're baking. If you don't think you're going to bake for like a while, you can put it in the fridge and it'll keep for a month. I usually pull mine out of the fridge 24 hours before I want to use it, and then I'll use a little, and then I'll feed it, and I'll let it sit for another 24 hours, and then I'll put it back in the fridge, because I don't bake a ton, but it is kind of a nice little fun treat to have when you do bake. That's show and tell. Let's slide it back.
Okay, so let me see if I can, there we go. Okay, so we gave you a lot of information, and you're probably thinking, where do I start? How do I add fermented foods to my diet? So a starting point, a really great place to start is just your local grocery store, right? So you can buy, store-bought sauerkraut and add it to a sandwich. You can add some store-bought kimchi and add it to a rice bowl. Maybe you try adding some kefir that's store-bought to a smoothie, right? There's a lot of things you can find at your grocery store that you can incorporate into your diet. And then once you get used to the flavors and kind of the textures and kind of the individual, things of these foods, you can try to venture out and try making some yourself at home. I will say that I have not attempted to make any at home, and Kelly has not attempted to make any home, but you can clearly see that Ashley is a guru with making them at home. So that is all we have. So thank you so much for joining us. And I think that if you are interested in getting a copy of those recipes, Diana is going to email it out to the participants after the talk. And then I think you can also get a copy of the slides if you're interested in them. So I think we have a couple minutes, just open it up for some questions. And I think Diana is going to talk, kind of get us started on those.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you again so much for this incredibly informative presentation. We have a number of questions. I'm going to field some of the first questions that we got in the chat. The first being, is there, let's see, do you have to use sugar when making homemade probiotics? Is it possible to use alternatives like honey or maple syrup to avoid refined sugars?
No, you will need the sugar that it calls for in the recipe. The honey won't work for kombucha. And I mean, really, I mean, when we're speaking, it's really just to feed the culture. And as dietitians, we know that, sugar versus honey, they all have similar effects on our blood sugar levels. And I wouldn't, there is kind of a thing where people avoid dairy, or they avoid sugar at the expense of being healthier, but then they also can avoid certain health benefits that come with those foods. So I wouldn't shy away from making kombucha just for the sugar effects.
All right, great. When heating or cooking kimchi or sauerkraut or miso, does it lose its probiotic qualities?
Yeah, it can if you add the live cultures during the heat when it's too hot. So like with the miso, is that what so you'd be cooking the soybeans, blending them, and at that point they cool down, and then you add the koji rice. So it's not killing the cultures. Or with yogurt, if you're adding those live cultures and the yogurt's heat treated afterwards or pasteurized afterwards, and that will kill off those live bacteria. So you, and with the kombucha, if you're adding that scalding hot tea together with the SCOBY, it will kill off the live bacteria. So you definitely want to caution that.
So not when you're fermenting it, but when you're using it later when you're cooking.
Yeah, I would just say like usually when I'm making like miso soup or something, you'll usually notice like in the recipes that if you like boiling water and however you want to make your base of like miso soup, and then you add all the vegetables or whatever you do and it's like cooked, and then you take like your pot off of the fire, and then you would mix in your miso after that. So it wouldn't be like a part of the cooking process per se. And then usually with like kimchi too, I usually would just add it after like it's on the heat, and you could just like take the pan or the pot off of the heat, the direct heat, and then you could always mix it after that. So that way it's not like receiving like that heat directly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Great.
it does. Thank you.
Are the bacteria in fermented foods killed by stomach acids? An article from UW Medicine quoted a physician who said that drinking kombucha wasn't helpful due to the beneficial bacteria being unable to get past our stomach. Thoughts around that?
So I know that there is research about where certain probiotics are activated and what area of the gut that they provide benefits. I will say that even if a food doesn't have probiotics, if it's fermented, it has health benefits on its own because of these acidic compounds. So it can still be healthy for digestion and have other like the antioxidants in the kombucha being easier to absorb, whether or not those exact probiotics from kombucha are doing all the things that they do. They're passing through some part of the gut and they're putting out kind of their medicine at that point of which they passed. So it's not necessarily how much like probiotic we have in our gut at any one time. It's just kind of what it supplies as it's going through.
Great. Actually, it's kind of going back to the sugar content in probiotics. Someone had asked, is added sugar in fermented food considered good for health?
I guess I would need a little more clarification of, are you talking about like if you made sourdough pancakes and you added maple syrup to them or something? Or are you adding, because if you're adding sugar to your kombucha, you're just creating fizz. You're not really creating a health benefit per se.
I see. I guess I can kind of add to that question too, because sometimes I'll get a bottle of kombucha and see that it has 29 grams of sugar. And then I think, oh my gosh, is this 29 grams of sugar that's being added to my daily sugar intake? And if I were to drink a kombucha every day, like what will that do in my blood sugar levels?
Yeah, it'll still, even healthy sugars affects our blood sugar levels. So I guess you just have to kind of weigh it as an overall sugar content of your diet. So, maybe it wouldn't be recommended to drink every single day for some people. Also, if you're having kombucha with a meal, it is going to affect your blood sugars differently because we know that sugars are digested differently when we have them with proteins or fibers versus just alone. But you're definitely right. I mean, healthy sugars still affect our sugars. And I would say, if it's taking the place of another beverage, particularly, of course, a soda or something, it's much healthier. But I mean, I drink a kombucha on the weekend. That's kind of my treat, but it's balance. Everything's balance.
Right. Thank you for that. And we're just going down the line of questions here. Is preserved lemon considered a pre-pro or postbiotic? Preserved lemon.
None of us know the answer to that one.
Very fair. A little bit more research to be done there. How does water kefir differ from milk kefir, and is it just as beneficial?
I'm not familiar with water kefir.
Mm-hmm. Or like kefir water.
Is there kefir water?
Mhm.
Oh, we have stocked it. Okay. So maybe just producing different bacteria or being, lactose free.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming that's just water and kefir grains to produce then just versus milk and kefir grains.
Mm-hmm. Right. This question pertains to one of the recipes, the sourdough starter. If I get black liquid in my sourdough starter, do I need to throw the whole thing out?
So, like I said, there could be a dark gray. It gets kind of tricky to know exactly for me. I don't want to give anyone food poisoning, but a lot of people will tell you just pour that off, just pour it off. It's good for you, and just stir all the rest of it up. I mean, if it's like all kind of turning black or any fuzz at all, I would just get a fresh starter from someone if you can. But there is like kind of a grayish liquid that forms on top. That's okay. So it's hard to decipher gray from black, but
fair. All right, we've got a few more questions here. And this one's an interesting one. Is fermenting a particular food item a way to reduce the negative gut reactions to that food raw, such as onions or garlics that are high in FOD, FODMAPs. I wanted to pronounce it that way, but if it's fermented, does it make it easier to process?
I would guess it would,
I know, I
because
would guess it
fermentation
would,
is,
but I don't know.
Yeah, because fermentation does make foods more digestible because of the acids that it emits. But that is actually a really interesting question.
Yeah. I would need to do some more research on that, but again, with Ashley, I feel like it would. But I don't. I mean, I think everybody's individual too, right? So if somebody eats a fermented onion and they're like, oh, this definitely doesn't cause as much gas as a raw onion, right? Everybody's going to have a little bit different reaction. But I don't know the science behind the FODMAPs and fermented foods.
Fair. Very interesting. Do acid reflux medications like Prilosec inhibit the probiotic benefits of probiotics? Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah, it would. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we were just thinking if it that it probably does not, because it preserve the acid and yeah. I thought I heard that maybe they were. Okay, so we can write down some questions and get back to you with some better answers. So
yeah, that's definitely a good follow-up one. And one of our last few questions in regard to a recipe. I just had it. How do you measure the? It was a question in regards to the cider. How are you able to measure the apple cider, the level of fermentation in apple cider, or the alcohol in hard cider, so you can determine whether or not the content is has reached dangerous levels?
So if you if you do the, I've actually, it's one that I explained that I actually hadn't made before, but I mean, dangerous levels, meaning it would get you, I don't believe, I think it's going to take a lot of time to get, I don't know what dangerous means, I guess. Sorry, if you have scraps in the door and together for a couple of weeks, I'm not exactly sure. You might have like a 3% alcohol content. And I know with kombucha, so the longer you let it ferment and the warmer temperature and the more sugar, you could probably manipulate the alcohol in that. To make it higher in alcohol.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, I think that was our last question. I want to thank you all so much for taking this, the time, space, and energy to present this valuable information. Again, we will be sending out the recipe, the copies of the recipe guide, a copy of the presentation, as well as a link to this recording for you all to rewatch, share with your friends. And if there are any lingering questions, we have the contact information for everyone here. Want to thank you all again so much for joining in, and we look forward to the next time we can all meet. Thank you.